Middle-earth has had many great artifacts: magic rings, magic swords, magic doors, magic statues, magic files, magic bread. But of these magical artifacts, perhaps the Palantiri are the most interesting. On the surface, they seem like simple scrying orbs, but they are in fact far more complex and have a colourful history as well. So in this complete history video, we're doing something different. We're not talking about a place or a people, we're talking about some objects. This is the story of the Palantiri. And if you haven't seen any of my other podcast type videos, I would like to make a disclaimer: this is the type of video that you can treat as a podcast. There will be visuals, but it's not necessary to watch the video. You can instead listen to it, perhaps while you work, or work out, or play games, or while you're cooking, or while you're commuting, or while you're doing suspicious holes in your backyard that are definitely not body shaped. Anyway, here we go. I hope you enjoy the ride. This video is brought to you by Palantiri. Give over your data, you have nothing to worry about. Okay, but seriously, the Palantiri are oddly relevant in this day and age, not necessarily because of anything Tolkien wrote, but because of the company, Palantiri, founded by Peter Thiel. Now, I don't want to get marked for future extermination, so all I'm going to say is Palantiri and Peter Thiel are very Sauron-coded. And because of this, there's actually a lot of misinformation about the Palantiri currently being spread on the internet. You have people saying that they're evil, but this isn't true. The Palantiri, like many other things, were a tool, and they absolutely weren't inherently evil. In fact, the Palantiri weren't created by the bad guys at all. As far as we know, the Palantiri were made by Feanor sometime in the Years of the Trees, in Valinor. They were spheres made of solid glass or crystal, but despite their apparent glassy nature, they were seemingly quite durable. We don't actually know how many Palantiri were created. We're aware of 8, but there may have been many more. They also differed in size and abilities. Some were small, no more than 30 centimeters across, whereas others were too large to be carried by a single person. So what did the Palantiri actually do? Well, they had two main uses: observation and communication. In regards to observation, the user could see things that were physically distant. However, there were some limitations. Some of the Palantiri only had a certain range. An example given to us is 500 miles for the Palantir in Minas Tirith and the one in Isengard. Another limitation is that while the Palantiri could see through physical barriers such as walls or mountains, they could only see places that light reached. So, for example, not a completely sealed chamber. This was a technique known as shrouding, and the Palantiri were often themselves shrouded by being kept in locked cases. And finally, the clarity of what was being observed depended greatly on the skill of the user. In other words, the better you were at handling a Palantir, the more you could zoom in or scroll your view. With some of the Palantiri, the user also had to orientate themselves on the other side of the stone for the direction they wished to view. To explain it better, if you want to look west, you need to be facing the eastern side of the stone. Also, the Palantiri did not transmit sound. And interestingly, the Palantiri could also observe visions from the past, but not the future. But once again, a user needed to be very adept with one. The communication aspect is fairly simple. If two Palantiri were manned, the users could see and communicate with each other, not through actual sound, but through thoughts, basically telepathy. However, it should be noted that this wasn't mind reading, which wasn't a feature of the Palantiri, but someone of significant power, like Sauron, could use a Palantir to dominate and extract the thoughts from another person. Some of the Palantiri were permanently linked with other Palantiri, whereas others, like with observation, needed to be orientated in a certain direction. In most cases, the Palantiri could only be in direct communication with one other stone at a time. If a third stone was to try and communicate with them, it would find the other two stones blank. As far as we're aware, Feanor did not bring any Palantiri with him when he and the Noldor returned to Middle-earth. Instead, they remained in Valinor through the First Age, with one, known as the Master Stone, being placed in the Tower of Avalone on the Isle of Tol Eressëa. They also remained in Valinor for most of the Second Age. This only changed sometime around the 33rd or 34th century of the Second Age, when Amandil, father of Elendil, was the Lord of Andúnië. At this point, Númenor was deep under the shadow, elves were not tolerated and were even banned under the reign of Argamilzor, and any of the faithful who welcomed them were punished. Sometime during this period, an elven ship did secretly get to Numenor carrying gifts for Amundil, 7 Palantiri. The idea was that if the elves could no longer come to Numenor, at least the faithful Numenorians would still be able to contact their elven friends in Valinor. The situation only got worse following Ar-Pharazôn's capture of Sauron. The kingdom began openly worshipping the Shadow, and thanks to Sauron's manipulation, Ar-Pharazôn decided to attack Valinor to seize immortality for himself. A few years earlier, Amundil had sailed into the west in an attempt to ask the Valar for forgiveness. We're unsure of his fate, but before he left, he urged Elendil and his sons to be prepared to set sail at a moment's notice, should Ar-Pharazôn follow through on his attack on Valinor. This warning was heeded, and as Numenor sunk beneath the waves, Elendil and his 9 ships were spared, and a storm carried them to Middle-earth. All 7 Palantiri were saved from the destruction, each being placed on their own ship with a star on the flag. 3 of the Palantiri were in the hands of Elendil, and 2 each in the hands of his sons, Isildur and Anarion. Elendil came ashore at Lindon, whereas Isildur and Anarion probably came ashore near Pelagir. Within a year, they had founded 2 new kingdoms, Arnor, ruled by High King Elendil, and Gondor, the junior kingdom, ruled jointly by Isildur and Anarion. Although the heartlands of Gondor and Arnor were very far apart, this distance could be offset by the strategically placed Palantiri, which mostly ended up in important cities and fortresses. So let's talk about the 7 individual Palantiri that were brought to Middle-earth by the Faithful. Let's start with the Osgiliath Stone, considered to be the chief of the 7 stones. The Osgiliath Stone was the largest, requiring multiple men to carry, and it was placed in the Dome of the Stars in Osgiliath, the capital of Gondor. The ceiling of the chamber was actually painted to resemble a starry sky, which really improved the immersion of using the stone. A unique ability of the Osgiliath Stone was its ability to eavesdrop, meaning it could observe the conversations of the other Palantiri without them knowing about it. Another fairly unique stone was the Elostirion Stone, or the Elendil Stone. This one was placed in Elostirion, the tallest and most westward of the 3 white towers in Emyn Baraid, built by Gil-galad for Elendil. It didn't actually communicate with the other 6 stones, and was fixed to only look westwards towards Valinor. If one looked through the stone, they could be granted visions of the Tower of Avalone, where the Master Stone was held, Tol Eressëa, and even Valinor itself. Elendil attempted to use it to view Numenor sunken beneath the waves, but it was hidden from him. Perhaps the stone that was second to the Osgiliath Stone was the Amon Sul Stone, placed in the watchtower of Amon Sul in the centre of Arnor. Like the Osgiliath Stone, the Amon Sul Stone was too large for a single man to move, but possibly thanks to its size, it did not have the range limitation that some of the other stones had. Because of this, the Amon Sul Stone was the Palantir that was used to contact the Osgiliath Stone, and was thus the best way for the 2 kingdoms to communicate with each other. The other 4 stones were considered to be the lesser stones. These were the Enumenas Stone, placed in the capital of Arnor. There was the Ithil Stone, placed in Minas Ithil, Isildur's city. There was the Orthanc Stone, placed in the strategically positioned fortress of Angranost, later Isengard. And finally, there was the Anor Stone, placed in Minas Anor, Anarion city. All 4 of these stones seem to have been identical in size, small enough to be easily carried by a single man. They had limitation in range when it came to observation. Tolkien says it was 500 miles, but this may not have been a hard limit, and none of them appear to have had any special abilities. Despite, or possibly thanks to their usefulness, the existence of the Palantiri were not common knowledge, and very few people had access to them. The royal line would allow certain people to use them, such as their top ministers who might require information, like the future stewards, as well as the wardens who would guard them and might sometimes be responsible for receiving messages or even sending them if the king was not there. This is what Arnor did during the Third Age, as the king was usually in Anumenas or Fornost and the chief Palantir was at Amon Sul. However, it should be noted that using a Palantir was physically straining, and even someone who mastered its use wouldn't walk away without consequences. A much later example is Denethor, who prematurely aged thanks to his constant use of the Palantir. Unfortunately, the history of the Palantiri is rather vague to begin with. When Sauron started the War of the Last Alliance, he managed to capture Minas Ithil, but when Isildur and his family escaped, they seem to have taken the Palantir with them. As the Last Alliance was gathering in Arnor, it seems likely that they were monitoring Anarion's defense of Gondor through the Amon-Sul Stone, with Anarion sending updates back through the Osgiliath Stone. After the war was over and Minas Ithil retaken, the Ithil Stone was returned to its rightful place. It's immediately after the war where our first Palantir becomes irrelevant, if it wasn't already irrelevant. This is the Elendil Stone, the one that only looked west, and of which Elendil was the sole user. After his death during the war, Círdan's elves became the caretakers of Elostirion, and by extension, the Elendil Stone. As far as we know, no mortal man used the Elostirion Stone from this point onwards, and instead Elostirion became something of a destination for elven pilgrims who wished to use the stone to catch a glimpse of Tol Eressëa, Valinor, and perhaps even Vardar herself atop Taniquetil. Following Isildur's death at the Gladden Fields, Arnor and Gondor officially became two separate kingdoms. We have no real inkling of how often they used the Palantiri to communicate with each other, or realistically, how much they used them in general. That said, they must have been perceived as extremely valuable tools, as evidenced by the dissolution of Arnor into three successor states in 861 of the Third Age. The three states, Arthedain, Cardolan, and Rhudaur, often fought each other, and the chief point of contention was Amon-Sul, not just because of its strategic location, but also because of the Amon-Sul Stone. When Arnor split, the Amon-Sul Stone wasn't the only one that was affected. King Amlaeth of Arthedain moved his capital to Fornost, and Anúminas seems to have been completely abandoned shortly afterwards. When Amlaeth moved, he took the Anúminas Stone with him to Fornost, where it would remain, although it was still referred to as the Anúminas Stone. Because Arthedain had both the useful northern Palantiri, it had an advantage over its rivals, and it also retained a way to keep contact with Gondor, despite the fact that Arthedain did not border Gondor, and did not seemingly have a major port in which messengers could sail to Gondor. The Anúminas Stone would soon be joined by another Palantir. Around 1300, Angmar was founded by the Witch King, the chief of the Nazgul, starting a centuries-long war with Arnor. In 1409, Angmar and its subject state in Rhudaur launched a massive invasion of Arthedain and Cardolan. The Tower of Amon-Sul was surrounded and then razed to the ground, with King Arveleg I of Arthedain falling in its defense. Despite this, the survivors from Amon-Sul managed to escape with the Amon-Sul Stone and get it to Fornost, where it would be safe alongside the Anúminas Stone. Remember, the Amon-Sul Stone was large and required multiple men to carry it, so it's rather impressive that it got away. Unfortunately, not all of the Palantiri were so lucky. In the south, Gondor was at the height of its power, which was probably aided by the use of the Palantiri, but this golden age was about to come to an end due to a self-inflicted wound, the Kinstrife Civil War. In 1437, King Eldacar and his loyalists were besieged in the capital of Osgiliath by Castamir and his rebels. When his situation became untenable, Eldacar was forced to flee, and in the aftermath, the city was sacked. The sack of the city was needless, brutal, and would ultimately hurt Castamir in the long term. It would also hurt Gondor. During the sack of the city, the Tower of the Dome of the Stars either caught fire or was destroyed in some other manner. We're not sure how it exactly happened, whether it was being carried away and was lost in an accident, or whether it simply happened during the destruction, but the Osgiliath Stone fell into the waters of the Anduin and was never seen again. The chief of the Palantiri, the one capable of seeing the furthest and listening in on other conversations, was gone. The history of the Palantiri doesn't really get better from here. As the Third Age progressed, messages between Arthedain and Gondor dwindled until they possibly ground to a complete halt. However, sometime between 1936 and 1940, Arthedain and Gondor re-established contact, most likely through the Palantiri. At this point, Gondor was still strong but well past its peak, whereas Arthedain was hanging on against Angmar by a thread. King Araphant of Arthedain and King Ondaher of Gondor came to the common conclusion that a single enemy was directing efforts against both kingdoms, and that they would need to work together. This was easier said than done. Arthedain was occupied with Angmar and otherwise too weak to send help, whereas while Gondor was strong enough to send help, they were occupied with the Wainwrighter Easterlings. Nonetheless, the re-establishment of communication wasn't completely pointless. Prince Arvedui of Arthedain married Firiel onto his daughter, with the further promise that Gondor would send help as soon as it was able. But by the time Gondor sent help, it was too late. In the winter of 1974, Angmar attacked Arthedain, Fornost was lost, and the kingdom was overrun. But once again, the Arnorians managed to keep the Palantiri from the Witch King's grasp. Arvedui and a small company of guards escaped Fornost, and after briefly holding out in the North Downs, they fled north, pursued by the Witch King's servants. They hid in some abandoned dwarf tunnels in the Blue Mountains before hunger forced them to surface, and eventually seek help from the Lossoth, the snowmen of Forakel. The Lossoth weren't exactly the most friendly people, but they pitied Arvedui and his men and provided them with food and shelter. Arvedui survived the winter and somehow got word of his plight to Círdan in Lindon, so Círdan sent a ship to pick up the king. What followed was one of the biggest disasters of the Third Age. The ship arrived in March, but because it was a particularly bad winter, the bay was still choked with ice and foul weather was on the horizon. The Lossoth realised this, and attempted to convince Arvedui to stay on land, at least until summer, where the Witch King's power over the weather would be lessened. Arvedui did not listen, and boarded the ship with both of his Palantiri. Before the ship had even left the bay, it was assailed by a great wind, which blew the ship onto the ice and piled even more against the hull. Overnight, the hull shattered, Arvedui and the entire crew perished, and the Amonsul stone and the Anuminas stone both fell into the icy waters, never to be seen again. Now, 3 stones had been lost to water, 2 in Forakel and 1 to the Anduin, but this wasn't even the worst fate to befall a Palantir. After being driven from the north, the Witch King returned to Mordor with the other Nazgul, and started gathering Sauron's old power. In 2000, they sallied forth from Mordor and besieged Minas Ithil, and 2 years later, they captured the city. This time, the Ithil stone was not carried from the city, so King Eärnil II of Gondor and his closest advisors could only hope that defenders of the city either managed to throw away or destroy the Ithil stone before the city fell. But because they had no way of confirming this, they figured it was safer to simply stop using the remaining Palantiri, just so they could avoid accidentally coming into contact with the Nazgul or worse. This was the wise decision, because the Ithil stone had in fact fallen into the hands of the Nazgul. Speaking of the remaining Palantiri, there was really only 2 left by now, the Anor stone and the Orthanc stone. But realistically, neither of these stones were overly useful anymore. Sure, the Anor stone could still be used to observe, but was it worth the risk of accidentally coming into contact with whoever had the Ithil stone? When the line of kings failed in Gondor, the stewards retained the rights to use the Anor stone, but none of them dared to, and it remained locked away in Minas Tirith, mostly forgotten. As for communication with the Orthanc stone, well, that wasn't exactly worthwhile, because by this point, Calanadon and Agranost were a backwater. Not long after, Orthanc would be shut, the keys to the tower would come into the possessions of the steward, and the Orthanc stone would be locked away and forgotten. But the Orthanc stone was not forgotten by everyone. Around 2400, Saruman reappeared in the Westlands and ended up spending plenty of time in the archives in Minas Tirith. During his time in Minas Tirith, he earned the trust of the stewards and might have learned about the Palantiri. Sometime afterwards, Isengard fell into the hands of the Dunlendings, but they couldn't enter Orthanc without the keys, so the Palantir was safe. When the fortress was retaken in 2759, Saruman offered to govern it in the name of Gondor. Both King Freylaf of Rohan and Steward Beren of Gondor welcomed this, so Saruman was given the keys to Orthanc, made the tower his new abode, and inside he found the Orthanc stone. That said, Saruman was still aware at this time that there were very real risks of using the Orthanc stone, so he refrained, even as he started sliding towards evil. In fact, Saruman was not the first person to start using a Palantir again. No, that person was Denethor II, Steward of Gondor. Denethor was a great man, but he was also prideful and grim, not just because of personal tragedy that occurred in his life, but also because he recognized that he would probably be the one that would lead Gondor in its darkest hour. He looked across at the newly arisen Mordor in despair and realized that he would need every little advantage he could possibly get. So he started using the Anor Stone, the first time anyone had done so in almost 1,000 years. At first, using the Palantir seemed to be a masterful move. Denethor proved to be adept at using it and managed to acquire all sorts of information and knowledge that aided him in his rule, but the good times did not last, for eventually Denethor came face to face with the worst fear of those long dead men who had first forsaken the Palantir, Sauron. We're not exactly sure when the Ithil Stone ended up in Sauron's possession, whether it was taken to him while he was still in Dol Guldur, or whether it was only taken to him after he returned to Mordor. Regardless, sometime before the year 3000, Sauron had it and was using it. Sauron immediately attempted to dominate Denethor during their contact, but Denethor was of good character, strong-willed, and rather importantly, had the right to use the Palantir through his position as the steward. Sauron's attempt failed, but he had a plan B. If he could not make the steward bow, then he would break him. During their contact, Sauron would show Denethor things that would make him despair, such as the power that Mordor had at its disposal. While Sauron could not make the Palantir lie, he could selectively show things so that Denethor was not getting the whole truth. Over the course of decades, these repeated encounters would gradually weaken Denethor and cause him to appear prematurely aged. A few years later, in 3000, Saruman would finally use the Orthanc Stone. At this point, Saruman was already well down the path of evil. He was actively searching for the One Ring, he had isolated and fortified himself inside Isengard, he was supporting Rohan's enemies, and most importantly, he had started breeding orcs. We don't know why Saruman started using the Orthanc Stone now, but it went as well as you would expect. He immediately came into contact with Sauron, and Sauron dominated him. Unlike Denethor, Saruman was already corrupted and had no right to use the Palantir, hence why Sauron was able to overcome his will. From this point on, Saruman would be Sauron's subject, ally, occasionally useful, pain in the ass, whatever you want to call it. Rather amusingly, Saruman didn't just come into contact with Sauron, but also occasionally Denethor. From Saruman, Denethor would extract useful information, although we're not exactly sure what that information was. Frustratingly for Sauron, he had no way of stopping this. Remember, you could not have a threesome with a Palantir, and you could not listen in on conversations unless you had the Osgiliath Stone, which had been lost in the Anduin. So before the War of the Ring, we have a Palantir triangle. Denethor uses the Anor Stone to spy on Mordor and get information from Saruman. Sauron uses the Ithil Stone to order Saruman around and attempt to break Denethor, and Saruman uses the Orthanc Stone to just kind of be stuck in the middle. Unfortunately, we don't know how exactly each of the remaining Palantiri were used during the War of the Ring. The explanation for this is that from the perspective of the Free Peoples, with the exception of Denethor, all of the Palantiri were lost or otherwise locked away and unused at this point in time. While Denethor, Saruman and Sauron do use the Palantiri to observe events, they were by no means omniscient, and as they all possessed one of the lesser Palantiri, they were all limited by distance. For example, despite their use of the Palantiri, neither Denethor, Saruman or Sauron was able to find the Ringbearer. The first Palantiri to reappear was the Orthanc Stone. As I said before, no one was aware Saruman was using it except Denethor and Sauron, and even when we look back at events, his use of it was clearly subtle. Perhaps the only event he seems to have learned about entirely through the Palantir was when Ugluk's warband was destroyed by Eomer at the eaves of Fangorn. As far as we're aware, there weren't any survivors from Ugluk's company, so the Palantir seems like the way Saruman learned of this. Assuming he was the old man that the three hunters encountered in Fangorn, which is likely, it seems he went to investigate. After Isengard is defeated, there is a parley with Saruman at Orthanc. After Saruman is thoroughly humiliated, he seemingly throws down a round object at Gandalf. However, Gandalf notes that it wasn't Saruman that threw it because it actually came from a higher balcony. He says that it was probably Grima Wormtongue who threw it, and Aragorn suggests that the reason it narrowly missed both Saruman and Gandalf was because Grima wasn't sure who he hated more. This theory is proven true moments later. As the party leaves the doors of Orthanc, they hear a great shriek from above, implying that Saruman was very, very upset that Grima had just thrown away his favourite toy. Pippin is the one who picks the Orthanc stone from the ground, but Gandalf takes it off him without offering any explanation as to what it is. Pippin doesn't take kindly to this, and that evening he cannot sleep because he can't stop thinking about the Palantir. Despite Merry telling him to forget about it, after everyone is asleep, Pippin goes and stealthily takes the stone from an asleep Gandalf. He sets it down, uses it, and immediately comes into contact with Sauron. The odds of this happening were actually incredibly low, because A, Pippin had to accidentally set the Palantir and himself so that they were facing Barad-dûr, and B, Sauron had to be using it at that exact moment. In the unfinished tales, we're actually told that Sauron didn't really use the Ithil Stone all that often because it was just one of many things in his collection, and he didn't trust any subordinate to use them, because none of them would be able to match Saruman or even Denethor. Now this could have been an absolute disaster for the Free Peoples, because Sauron could have easily dominated Pippin through the Palantir and then gotten him to spill basically everything. But fortunately, Sauron completely misunderstood the situation. He thought that Pippin's appearance in the Palantir was Saruman showing him that he had a halfling as a prisoner, which is important because at this point Sauron is still under the impression that a halfling possesses the One Ring. He tells Pippin to tell Saruman that the dainty is not for him, and that he will send someone to collect it soon. Another interesting note from this brief interaction is that before Sauron realizes who he is talking to, he asks why Saruman has neglected to report for so long. This tells us that Sauron and Saruman had not been communicating through the Palantir for quite some time at this point. So despite Pippin's blunder, no harm is done, and it does reveal the secret link between Orthanc and Barad-dûr, thereby confirming that Sauron had the Ithil Stone. Gandalf then gives Aragorn the Orthanc Stone because he is its rightful owner, but counsels him to be careful with it. The next day, Aragorn also uses the Orthanc Stone and also comes into contact with Sauron. Due to his innate strength and being the rightful owner of the stone, Aragorn is able to keep Sauron from bending the stone to his will, revealing himself as Isildur's heir and showing off Anduril, the reforged Narsil, a sword that Sauron was very familiar with. After the encounter, he uses the Palantir to observe what's happening in Gondor and sees the Black Fleet of Umbar approaching. He realizes that this is going to divide Gondor's strength. So he decides he must deal with the Corsairs, and the only way to achieve this is by going through the paths of the dead and summoning the Oathbreakers. There's no mention of Aragorn taking the Orthanc Stone with him, so he might have left it at Helm's Deep. While Aragorn's intention was to sow doubt in Sauron's heart and to gather information, him using the Orthanc Stone had other consequences. For one, it made Sauron realize that Saruman must have been defeated. He had actually already dispatched a flying Nazgul to Isengard a few days earlier, and that Nazgul had reached the fortress the day before, but they would not have returned to Barad-dûr by the time Aragorn used the Orthanc Stone. The other consequence was that Sauron now believed that Aragorn had the One Ring. After all, how could he have defeated Saruman, and why else would he have the balls to reveal himself to Sauron? To Sauron, this was go time. He needed to strike now before Aragorn had any chance to gather the strength of the Free Peoples against him. The final stone to reveal itself is the Anor Stone. After Pippin screws up, he and Gandalf ride to Minas Tirith where they meet with Denethor. During the conversation, Denethor points out that he already knows about what has happened in Rohan and Isengard, implying that he had been observing events there. Funnily enough, he actually references the Palantiri in that conversation, but does not admit to using them. During the Siege of Gondor, Denethor drops yet another hint that he had been using the Anor Stone. When a message is brought to him that Caer Andros has fallen, Denethor says that he already knows. But even though he gained a wealth of knowledge through the Anor Stone, the Palantir is ultimately what ends up killing Denethor. After years of use, his body and mind had weakened, leaving him vulnerable to succumbing to despair. This moment comes when Faramir is seemingly mortally wounded, robbing the steward of his last son. Like a drug addict, Denethor heads into the White Tower and uses the Palantir one last time, and sees the Corsair fleet nearing the city. This leads him to believe that southern Gondor has already fallen and that any chance of defending the city is lost. Ironically, he doesn't know that the Corsair fleet has already been commandeered by Aragorn at this point. Maybe, if he'd zoomed in a little, he would have seen that. So Denethor decides that he's going to burn both himself and Faramir. He goes to the Silent Street with some servants, but is ultimately stopped by Gandalf, Pippin, and Beregond. His plan foiled, Denethor finally reveals the source of his despair, the Anor Stone. He says that he's seen the vast extent of Sauron's power, and that even if they win today, they will still ultimately lose. He also reveals his knowledge of Aragorn, the heir of Isildur. Although Denethor suspected Aragorn's existence prior to using the Palantir, it's possible that he had been observing him while he was in Rohan. Then Denethor sets the house aflame and lies down upon the table, clasping the Palantir against his chest. He burns to death because if you're committed to going, then why not pick an incredibly painful way? The house soon collapses due to the flames, but despite the fire and rubble, the Anor Stone does survive. We know this because we're told that afterwards, whenever someone looked into it, all they would see was two aged hands withering in the flame. The only way to avoid seeing this is if you had the strength of will to make it show you something else. At last, we reach the final fate of the Ithil Stone. Sauron probably used it to watch Aragorn and the host of the West approach the Black Gate, but once again, he failed to spot the Ringbearer approaching Mount Doom, and this would be his own doom. The quest to destroy the One Ring succeeds, Sauron is destroyed, and Barad-dûr collapses, resulting in a cascade of destruction across Mordor. Despite their fragile appearance, the Palantiri were surprisingly durable. The Orthanc Stone survived being thrown from a tower, hitting a balcony and stairs as it fell. The Anor Stone survived a fire and a building collapsing on it. However, none of this really compares in scale to the destruction of Barad-dûr. If not destroyed by fire or by a great impact, then at the very least the Ithil Stone would have been buried beneath a huge mass of rubble. While I have no doubt that the ruins of Barad-dûr would eventually be scoured for anything useful, I don't think this would have been the first thing on anyone's minds, and given that few people even knew of the Palantiri, it's not like the potential of finding one amidst the ruins would lure treasure hunters or other adventurous souls. In the end, I think it would be fair to say that the Ithil Stone was also lost. So we reach the end of the Third Age, and of the 7 Palantiri, only 3 remain: the Elendil Stone, the Orthanc Stone, and the Anor Stone. Of these, the Orthanc Stone is really the only one that is still useful. The Elendil Stone only looks west and is watched by the elves, and the Anor Stone only shows Denethor's final moments unless you have the willpower to get it to show you something else. As for the other Palantiri, the Inuminas and the Amon Sul stones were lost in the icy waters of Forokel in 1975, the Osgiliath stone was lost in the Anduin in 1437, and the Ithil stone was lost during the destruction of Barad-dûr. While perhaps all 4 of these Palantiri might be recoverable, assuming you have diving equipment, it's pretty unlikely that they would have been found. So what becomes of the Palantiri beyond the Third Age? Well, we know the Elendil Stone was removed by Círdan and taken to Valinor when he finally sailed into the west. As for the other 2, we don't know. Both of them still would have been useful, and now that Sauron was no more, there was no danger in using them. It's possible that they were used as before, with perhaps maybe one of them remaining in Minas Tirith and the other one being sent to the rebuilt Inuminas, so that messages between the 2 halves of the reunited kingdom could be quickly sent and received. As long as you had someone strong enough watching over the Anor Stone, this still would have been possible. Alternatively, they might have just been locked away for good. After all, the days of the elves were rapidly coming to an end, and the Palantiri were elven artifacts. In the future, would men have the strength and wisdom to even wield a Palantir? Because while they were useful tools, I think Denethor showed that the person could start using them for evil. Not that Denethor did use them for evil, but rather someone similarly paranoid, yet less moral, and less preoccupied with, Sauron, could start using them to spy on their own people, to discover every secret, plot, and useful bit of information. Sounds familiar. But seriously, we also saw that the Arnorians were willing to fight over them. The kings of Cardolan and Rhudawer were willing to sacrifice their soldiers over the Amon Sul stone just to gain something more of an advantage. Who's to say that one day the lords of the reunited kingdom might not do the same over the remaining 2 Palantiri? Or perhaps they wouldn't have needed to be locked away. Perhaps in a world where magic continued to fade, the Palantiri would simply stop working one day. Whatever happened to them, they're not around anymore. We have mobile phones. But the company is still around. The company is still here. And honestly, they're just really great. Way better than the actual Palantiri, in fact. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, or at least found it interesting. The amusing thing about the Palantiri is that Tolkien was often very vague when it came to magic in his universe, and while some of that vagueness still remains with the Palantiri, he did actually spend multiple pages describing what they did and how they used them in detail, as if he were writing an instruction manual. You can find all of that in the Unfinished Tales. Seriously, if you haven't already, read that book. It's super underrated, it has some fantastic lore, and it's not really that difficult to read. Cheers, farewell, and remember, Palantir is a great company that will never be implicated in anything bad.